The manager spoke loudly on purpose, as if he wanted the entire line to hear the verdict before even touching the keyboard. He said that the man couldn't afford it, with a crooked smile and his chin raised, while his eyes wandered over the worn cotton shirt, the old watch with its cracked strap, and the shoes with soles worn from walking across the city to save on transportation. The man held a brown envelope against his chest, as if it contained the last thing he still obeyed in his life. I didn't answer right away. I just breathed deeply, feeling the dry air of the air conditioner scratch my throat, while two people in line lowered their heads and a third took out their cell phone, sniffing out humiliation as entertainment. At that moment, it wasn't about money. It was about being limited to nothing in front of strangers. If this story has already captivated you, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, because what happened in that branch would still leave many people speechless. The man's name was Frank Harvey. He was 58 years old, and he carried a weariness that didn't come from age, but from the last 7 months trying to keep his younger brother's mechanic shop afloat after a stroke that left him speechless and without steadiness in his hands. He didn't look like a premium client, nor did he seem like someone who knew the manager by his first name, and perhaps for that very reason, Marcelo, the branch manager, decided to treat him like a fraud before treating him like a person. But Frank wasn't there to ask for a favor, a loan, or patience. He had to complete an urgent transfer before the end of the workday, and the clock on the panel seemed to be ticking against him. Marcelo held the envelope with 2 fingers, as if afraid of getting his hand dirty, took out the payment order, and let out a short laugh when he saw the amount. He said it had to be a mistake, then turned the paper aside and said, no longer hiding his mockery, where had a man like him gotten the courage to show up with a number like that? Frank felt the back of his neck grow hot, not from shame, but from realizing that if he lost a few more minutes, the hospital in Oklahoma wouldn't confirm the girl's surgery. A girl, Hannah, 9 years old, his brother's daughter, hospitalized, waiting for a procedure that depended on the payment that afternoon. When Frank tried to explain, Marcelo cut him off with an open hand in the air, took the identification document, and finally looked at the name of the account holder. That's when his smile stopped halfway. The name on the screen didn't match the man before him. Marcelo blinked once, then again, as if the system were lying, and Frank immediately noticed the microscopic change in the manager's face, that second when arrogance loses its stability before donning another mask. The account was linked to the Helena Lacerda Foundation, a discreet institution, but well known behind the scenes of philanthropic hospitals and highly complex programs, with audited multi-million-dollar transactions, international agreements, and a long history of secret actions. The detail that caught Marcelo's attention, however, wasn't the available amount. It was the internal observation that appeared below the authorized account holder's registration. Full attorney, unrestricted access, contingency authorization, direct contact with the board president. Frank didn't raise his voice or change his posture. He simply extended his hand, asking for the document back with the quiet firmness of someone who had already endured too many humiliations to waste energy on posturing. No one at that agency imagined that the unassuming man carried a surname he would avoid displaying for decades. Helena Lacerda, the older sister who gave her name to the foundation, had died 15 years earlier after selling her stake in a hospital equipment company and dedicating almost her entire fortune to children on surgery waiting lists, with a stark condition in the bylaws. No relative could use the money for luxury, influence, or social protection. Frank accepted this condition without hesitation because he knew the exact weight of that money. He had seen children dying while waiting for authorization, witnessed fathers sleeping in the hallway, and mothers signing papers without understanding half the words. Since then, his life had narrowed to the essentials: workshop, hospital, accounting, cold coffee in a plastic chair, unbranded clothes, old car, unglamorous exhaustion. The world was a failure. But inside, Frank lived with an almost terrible discipline. Marcelo tried to compose himself with a professional smile, the kind that appears when fear disguises politeness. He said he was lucky to have avoided a misunderstanding, left his chair, offered water, apologized for the standard procedure, and lowered his voice to almost a whisper. Frank didn't leave. The transfer request to the Children's Hospital in Oklahoma needed to be authenticated urgently because Hannah's surgical window closed at midnight, and any delay would throw the girl back into an unpredictable waiting list. The antagonist in that story, however, wasn't just the manager. It was an entire machine that fed on appearances, performance, and wasted time. Behind the glass, the tellers continued calling out numbers as if the world couldn't leave the inside of a bank branch. And, when Marcelo finally entered the release code, a red notification blocked the operation. The account was under internal preventative blocking. Frank felt his stomach sink, as if the ground had given way beneath him. Marcelo read the message silently, and it became clear again, now without the comfort of superiority. The block had been imposed that same morning by the Regional Compliance Department under suspicion of an atypical delivery linked to an internal request that was still incomplete. Frank realized at that moment that there was more than just bureaucracy involved. That foundation was making large enough transfers to arouse envy, and he knew the smell of fraud from the way certain voices began to plead for excessive calm. Hannah was in a hospital bed almost 500 kilometers away, her thin chest rising with effort, and the monitor marking pauses that no uncle should hear on the phone. Still, Frank didn't lose his composure. He picked up his cell phone, opened the gallery, and looked at a photo of the girl with the blue woolen strands she tied around her wrist to feign courage. Then he would remove her eyes. Something in that agency was very wrong. Marcelo called the operations supervisor with a tense urgency that no longer seemed like politeness, but defensiveness. The woman arrived adjusting her blazer and froze upon seeing the account name, then cast the manager a glance, too brief to be innocent. Frank noticed. He also noticed when she asked that the side room door be closed, and when the security guard, until then distracted, moved from the corridor as if a tired man could suddenly become threatened. Frank's past had taught him to consider the moment when people stop hiding their cards and begin protecting something greater than their own trust. On the other end of the line, at the hospital, a nurse texted, "We need confirmation in less than an hour." Frank slowly put his phone away, as if holding his own heart in the palm of his hand. The public humiliation had already been great, but now it was transforming into something more dangerous, a race against people willing to erase traces before the truth could be revealed. The side room smelled of old carpet, reheated coffee, and paper that had been stored for too long. Marcelo closed the door with excessive care, as if delicacy could disguise the panic, and the supervisor, Denise, asked Frank to understand the need for an internal check before any extraordinary authorization. Frank took it without blinking, Hannah's photo still vivid in his memory, and the nurse's words throbbing inside like a fever. Denise spoke of protocol, compliance, prevention, smooth words used to delay what was bleeding. When he entered the formal blocking number and the responsible party's identification, the two exchanged a short glance, the kind that betrayed a previous conversation. Marcelo said the regional system was terrifying. Frank knew there was a lie from the rhythm of the other's breathing. And while he wrote down their names on a folded sheet from the envelope itself, he noticed a forgotten detail on the table, a registration change form partially covered by a blue folder. The paper seemed ordinary to anyone else, but not to Frank, trained by years of accountability and silent audits. In the upper corner was the Foundation's own letterhead. In the authorized delivery field, there was a request for the emergency inclusion of a new validation contact, filed at 8:13 that morning, digitally signed in the name of a board member who had died 3 years earlier. His throat went dry. Before he could pull the sheet out, Denise quickly retrieved it and said it pertained to another process. Frank let his chair slowly recline so the noise would pass through. Scratched, he stepped onto the floor and interrupted the performance. He didn't raise his voice. He only said why a death still signed documents related to the foundation. Marcelo's face turned pale for the third time that day. Outside, someone knocked on the door, and the ensuing silence had the exact texture of fear. A thin woman entered, her hair in a hastily styled bun, a senior cashier badge hanging crookedly from her lapel. Her name was Joanna, and she carried a tray of water glasses that no one had ordered. Frank noticed, from the almost invisible tremor in her hand, that the water was an excuse. As she set down the tray, Joanna left a small folded piece of paper next to the saucers and left without looking at them. Marcelo didn't even notice. Denise saw it too late. Frank calmly picked up the napkin as if cleaning his fingers and only unfolded it in his lap under the table. There were 2 crooked lines there, written in blue pen. "Don't sign anything." They tried to switch the phone number for the validation. The camera at counter 4 recorded everything. His heart raced, not with hope, but because the story had just gained depth. It wasn't a random blockage. Someone had tried to create a false door inside the foundation. And, if the recording existed, the fraud had a body, a time, and a face. Denise changed her tone. She said that Frank had asked to wait for the regional director, who was in a meeting, and suggested rescheduling the transfer for the following morning, as if a child's preoperative time could be pushed back by corporate politics. It was at that moment that Frank's cell phone vibrated again. A voice message from his brother, sent through the hospital corridor, arrived short, muffled, and almost unbearable. He didn't play it all, but the beginning was enough to understand. Hannah's respiratory problems had worsened. Frank closed his eyes for a second and saw, with cruel clarity, the blue thread on the girl's wrist, the crooked drawings of planets in her notebook, the way she feigned bravery. When we opened our eyes, there was something different about him. The pain continued. He requested immediate access to the regional manager, invoked a foundation contingency clause, and said, in a low, firm voice, that an attempted internal fraud had occurred at that very moment. Marcelo reacted badly to the calm firmness, because arrogant people tend to be guided by volume, not substance. He clenched his jaw, stated that a serious accusation without proof could trigger security, and tried to tip the scales like any coward trained to use procedure as a weapon. Frank almost felt pity. Almost. He took a narrow folder, tied with an elastic band, from his pocket and placed on the table an independent audit document from the foundation, filed 2 weeks earlier, which already contained warnings about irregular updating efforts of sensitive contacts in 2 different branches. There were no names, only patterns, coinciding schedules, manual accesses, validations outside the workflow. Marcelo looked at Denise, and Denise couldn't hold his gaze back. The atmosphere seemed to shrink. From the corridor came the dry noise of the revolving door and the metallic voice calling another number, as if the bank continued breathing normally, while a gear might start grinding inside. Then the office landline rang. Denise answered, listened for 2 seconds, and paled. She handed the phone to Marcelo, who listened silently, nodding with servile speed. When she hung up, she tried to regain authority by saying that the regional superintendent would arrive in 15 minutes and that no one would leave until there was a complete clarification. The phrase was like an order, but also like imprisonment. Frank understood the move immediately. To buy time, isolate a witness, adjust versions, perhaps erase the video from counter 4 before he could breathe outside that agency. The real danger was no longer just losing Hannah's surgery. It was letting slip the only evidence capable of dismantling the fraud. And, as if fate decided to tighten the throat of that afternoon even more, the agency lights flickered once, then again, and all the computers. Restarted Joanna, outside, turned her face toward the room, her eyes wide. Somewhere in the system, someone just pulled the right plug. The announcement lasted less than 20 seconds, but it was enough to change the atmosphere in the agency. Monitors returned to login screens, printers spat out truncated sheets, and a nervous murmur lingered among clients and employees, like the smell of burnt wire. Denise left the room saying I needed to check the network. Marcelo stayed, but couldn't hide that he wanted to be anywhere else. Frank declared himself before anyone asked permission to open the door. In the main room, Joanna was already waiting for him, her eyes ablaze with the kind of courage that arises when fear becomes less than guilt. Without touching him, just passing by, she suggested that the camera backup hadn't been done on the restarted server, but on an internal terminal locked in the treasury. She also said that Denise had asked a technician to clean counter 4 as soon as the system crashed. It wasn't a panel, it was a cut. Frank followed her down the narrow corridor beside the cash registers, hearing Marcelo protest behind him and security telling him to stop. But there were times when obeying was just another way to lose. As he crossed that restricted access area, he felt his old knee, his breath shorten, the sweat hidden beneath his shirt. And yet he didn't slow his pace. Hannah was in some white room waiting for money that already existed, an approved surgery, a concrete chance being held by the wrong hands. Upon reaching the treasury door, he found Denise with a technician kneeling before the terminal, a flash drive already plugged in, and the dark screen about to restart in maintenance mode. She turned with a clean, unmasked anger and asked who had authorized her entry. Frank didn't even answer. His eyes had gone straight to the technician's badge. The last name was the same as Marcelo's. What had been brewing since the first taunt took brutal form in that instant. It wasn't just prejudice or the rudeness of a manager accustomed to judging people by their clothes and posture. There was a familiar, internal expression there, stitched together by blind trust, privileged access, and the arrogant certainty that no one simple enough to be humiliated would also be dangerous enough to react. Marcelo reached the hallway breathless, told his cousin to get out of the terminal, and took back the remote control, speaking louder, but his voice was already cracked. Frank took his cell phone out of his pocket, started recording, and said, for the first time without lowering his voice, that the footage, that terminal, and that last name had been handed over to the police, the Foundation's board, and the press specializing in philanthropic healthcare. Then his phone vibrated again. It was the hospital. And even before answering, he knew there was no more time to hesitate. The call from the hospital was punctuated by hallway noises, rushing footsteps, and a professional voice struggling not to break down. The doctors explained that Hannah was still eligible for surgery, but the surgical center would only keep the team mobilized for another 40 days. After that, the anesthesiologist would be reassigned. The slot would be given to someone else, and the silent cruelty of hope would begin again. Frank listened to everything with the phone pressed to his ear, his eyes fixed on the dark screen of the terminal, as if he could force the truth to light up. When he hung up, his whole body seemed pulled to two opposite places: the hospital where the girl needed him, and that corridor where he could prove her disappear forever. Then something happened that no one there had foreseen. Joanna called out her voice in the crowded room and, in a firm tone, called over two clients who were still in line. She said that they had seen Marcelo humiliate Frank and could testify. For the first time, the shame shifted sides. The two women approached without hesitation. One was a retired teacher, the other a neighborhood shopkeeper, and both carried on their faces the mature indignation of those who had swallowed too many insults in life to even notice the smell of it from afar. In front of security, the technician and half the agency already silent, they confirmed that Marcelo had refused service even before checking the system, laughed at the price, insinuated fraud, and tried to expel Frank from the table. The initial setup seemed somewhat like an internal scheme, but it wasn't. Public humiliation destroys the manager's main moral defense, that he will only follow protocol. Frank immediately grasped the importance of the situation and began recording the statements as well, quietly narrating the date, time, and full names. Marcelo interrupted, but was restrained by the security guard himself, who was now no longer sure who he was protecting. When the mask of authority falls, even the uniforms begin to question things. The decisive move came from the least expected source of arrogance. Joanna, her badge still trembling on her chest, entered the treasury, typed in her own contingency supervision password, and accessed a secondary menu that the technician pretended didn't exist. There, an automatic mirror of the in-person service transmissions was stored outside the main station and protected by auditorium-style audio. Denise moved to stop her, but Frank placed his body in the middle, not violently, but with the silent solidity of someone who finally understood the magnitude of the terrain he was treading. In seconds, the image of Counter 4 appeared on the screen. Everyone saw Marcelo accept, at 8:13 in the morning, an envelope from his cousin, the technician. They saw Denise instruct the manual update of the validation phone. They saw the two of them trying to process a change linked to the foundation using the name of a deceased board member. The proof not only existed, it breathes. It was at that moment that the regional superintendent arrived, accompanied by a gray-haired man in a simple suit, whom no one from the agency immediately followed. Marcelo rushed to speak first, relying on the old reflex of those who manipulate narratives before they take root. But Frank had already sent the videos, the audio from the hallway, and the terminal recording to 3 recipients simultaneously. The Foundation's board, a prosecutor connected to hospital agreements, and the president of the bank's own Integrity Commission. The gray-haired man was then introduced. It was Mauro Tavares, an external member of the Foundation's board and former director of internal controls at a national institution, summoned by Frank immediately after the first sign of fraud. Blood drained from Denise's face like water down a drain. She saw too late that the simple man before her had never been unprotected. They had simply chosen to live without the armor of status, and that would blind them. Marcelo's downfall didn't come from shouting, scandal, or an improvised heroic gesture. It came from the exact sum of what he despised: witness testimony, documentation, patience, method, and truth. The superintendent collected the files right there. Denise and the terminal technician tried to block both of their credentials and called the police to formally preserve the images. Marcelo tried to say it was all just a preventative measure, but the recording itself shows this in detail, including the moment he laughed before verifying the account name. Meanwhile, Mauro used his contingency authorization and, with double validation through a secure channel, authorized the transfer to the hospital in front of everyone. The receipt came out of the printer with a dry noise that, to Frank, sounded like a truck filling up. He held that paper with his still trembling hands, closed his eyes for a second, and finally allowed hope to enter where fear had been reigning for hours. 2 hours later, as night fell over the wet hospital parking lot, Frank received a message that would sustain him for the rest of his life. Surgery had begun. He stood under the awning, the light rain dripping on the concrete, the transfer receipt still folded in his pocket, crumpled from being squeezed so much. His brother, sitting in a plastic chair with sunken eyes and unshaven beard, couldn't speak when he saw him. He only gripped his arm tightly and lowered his head, as if that simple gesture could release months of pent-up fear. Frank didn't say much either. There were days when the interval arrived so weary it felt like sadness. But for the first time in a long time, the silence between them wasn't defeat. It was a journey. It was an almost unbearable feeling of having snatched a real chance from the hands of people who treated lives like a cog in a machine. In the following weeks, the agency was audited. Denise and Marcelo were removed from their positions. The technician was held accountable along with them, and Joanna, the employee who chose risk over mission, became a central figure in the investigation. Frank testified without triumphalism, handed over every record, conducted interviews, and returned to what he always wanted to do. Record spreadsheets, corridors, authorizations, and children who only needed someone not to fail at the exact moment. Hannah survived the surgery and left the ICU with the blue thread still attached to her wrist, now loose on her pale skin, like a childlike reminder that courage can also take the form of a string. When she asked if her uncle had gotten into a fight at the bank, Frank let it slip for the first time and simply replied that sometimes some doors jam because they've become accustomed to opening only for the wrong people, and that, on that day, she had been stronger than all of them. Months later, Frank returned to the same agency, not to close accounts or flaunt victory, but to implement a new foundation protocol, urgent transfers with double external redundancy for critical pediatric cases. He entered wearing the same simple shirt, the same old watch, and with the same unhurried steps. No one laughed. No one assumed anything. In the glass, where there had once been a reflection of humiliation, he saw only an ordinary man upholding the dignity that had almost been denied him. Before leaving, he passed by counter number 4, lightly touched the wooden counter, and saw Hannah running slowly down the hallway of her house. The scar on her chest hidden under her t-shirt, her whole life still ahead of her. Some people confuse simplicity with weakness until the day they discover, too late, that true power almost never makes a sound when it enters. Have you ever been in a similar situation? If this story touched you in any way, leave a like and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones.